Lake of Blood, 70,000 at Cannae, Carthage, late summer, 216 BC. A Senate chamber falls silent as soldiers pour something onto the marble floor. Not coin, not treasure. Gold rings, thousands of them, spilling out of sacks and rolling across the stone in a hollow, endless clatter. Each ring was pulled from the finger of a dead Roman nobleman, cut from a corpse on a battlefield 400 miles away. Ancient accounts claim the pile filled 3.5 bushels. Do the arithmetic, and you are standing in front of physical proof that thousands of Rome's ruling class died in a single afternoon, the battle that produced. That pile of gold happened near a small grain depot in southern Italy called Cannae, and by the time the sun went down that day, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman and Allied soldiers lay dead on a plain barely a few miles wide. Historians still argue over the exact number, but even the most conservative estimate makes August 2nd, 216 BC, one of the single bloodiest days any army has ever suffered in any war in any century. More Romans died at Cannae in one afternoon than American soldiers died across the entirety of the Vietnam War. This is not a story about a lost battle. Rome lost plenty of battles and survived. This is the story of a trap built with such total mathematical precision that it swallowed an army twice the size of the force that built it. And the two very different men, Roman and Carthaginian, whose decisions in the days after made sure the winner of the battle still lost the war. By 216 BC, Rome had already been humiliated twice by the same enemy. Hannibal Barca had marched an army, including war elephants, over the Alps in winter, and crushed Roman forces at the Trebia River and then again at Lake Trasimene, ambushing an entire consular army marching blind through morning fog beside a lake, killing 15,000 men in a single strike. Rome's response had been to appoint a dictator, Fabius Maximus, who refused to fight Hannibal directly at all. He shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassed its supply lines, and starved it of decisive engagements. The strategy worked. It also made Fabius wildly unpopular. Roman citizens wanted vengeance, not patience, and they mocked him as cunctator, the delayer. So Rome tried something different. For 216 BC, the Republic elected 2 consuls to share command, a deliberate check on any single man's power. Lucius Aemilius Paulus was cautious, experienced, and skeptical of a decisive confrontation. Gaius Terentius Varro was his opposite in nearly every way, a populist, ambitious, and utterly convinced Rome's problem was too much caution, not too little. Roman law required the 2 men to alternate supreme command day by day, one of the strangest arrangements ever handed to an army about to fight for its survival. And Hannibal understood exactly what to do with it. Rome raised the largest army it had ever fielded, somewhere close to 86,000 men, an overwhelming number built specifically to end this war in a single stroke. Hannibal had roughly 50,000. On paper, Rome held every advantage that mattered. Hannibal chose the ground himself, a flat, open plain beside the town of Cannae in Apulia, terrain with almost no natural obstacles, no hills to break a formation, no woods to hide an ambush. To Roman eyes it looked like exactly the kind of ground a smaller army should never choose. That was the point. Open ground was where Hannibal's real weapon, his cavalry, could operate without restriction, and he knew it far better than the Romans marching toward him did. There was even a wind. Locals called it the Volturnus, a hot, dust-filled gale that blew steadily across that stretch of plain in high summer, directly into the faces of any army approaching from the west. Hannibal arranged his lines so that wind blew straight into Roman eyes and lungs the entire morning, choking them with dust and sand before a single blade was drawn. On the day of battle, command rotated to Varro, the aggressive one. He formed the Roman infantry into an unusually deep, dense formation, packing his soldiers shoulder to shoulder in a mass built for one purpose: to punch straight through Hannibal sent her with overwhelming weight and end the war in an afternoon. He never suspected that the very density he was so proud of would become the mechanism of his own army's destruction. Hannibal placed his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, in the center of his line, arranged in a shallow crescent that bulged forward toward the Romans. His hardened veteran African infantry, his best soldiers, waited on the flanks, held back, almost invisible behind the curve. It looked from the Roman side like precisely the weak point an army should attack. The Romans obliged. Varro's massed infantry slammed into that bulging center, and the Gallic and Spanish line, exactly as designed, began giving ground. Not collapsing, bending, the Romans pushed harder, sensing victory, unaware they were not breaking the line so much as walking deeper into a bag that was slowly closing behind them. The crescent inverted, curving the other way, and the Roman formation, so proud of its density minutes earlier, began losing the one thing density requires to survive: room to maneuver. Men in the rear ranks kept pushing forward, unaware anything was wrong, crushing the men ahead of them into an ever-tightening mass, while the infantry ground forward into the trap. The actual battle was being decided elsewhere. On the flanks, Hannibal's heavy cavalry, commanded by his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, tore through the Roman cavalry on one wing in a fight so lopsided it barely lasted an hour. Instead of chasing the fleeing survivors for plunder, a fatal mistake nearly every other ancient cavalry force would have made, Hasdrubal reformed his squadrons, rode entirely around the back of the battle, and slammed into the allied Italian cavalry, holding the opposite Roman flank from behind. That second force broke almost immediately, caught between Numidian horsemen in front and Hasdrubal's returning cavalry from the rear, with both Roman flanks now empty of cavalry. There was nothing left to stop what came next. Hasdrubal turned his squadrons a final time and drove them directly into the exposed rear of the Roman infantry. The same infantry still pushing triumphantly forward into what they believed was a collapsing enemy center. At the same moment, Hannibal's veteran African infantry on both flanks wheeled inward, striking the Roman formation from both sides at once. The trap closed completely. Front, back, left, and right, the largest army Rome had ever raised was now sealed inside a ring of Carthaginian steel with nowhere left to retreat. What followed was not really a battle anymore. Packed so tightly that many men could not lift their arms to swing a sword, Roman soldiers were cut down where they stood, unable to reach an enemy or flee a friend. Ancient writers describe men suffocating in the crush before a blade ever touched them, trampled by their own comrades in a panic with no possible direction of escape. The killing lasted for hours, methodical and total. When it finally ended, the historian Polybius put Roman and allied dead near 70,000 men, with several thousand more taken prisoner. Livy's figures run somewhat lower, closer to 50,000. But even the smallest ancient estimate describes a single afternoon that erased a meaningful percentage of every Roman male of military age alive that year. 80 senators are said to have died on that field, a number that gutted the Roman government itself for a generation. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus died fighting rather than flee, refusing an offered horse so he could stand with his dying soldiers. Consul Varro survived, gathering a small remnant of cavalry and escaping to the nearby town of Venusia, a decision that would define the rest of his life in ways nobody at Cannae could have predicted. Hannibal's men moved across the field afterward, doing what victorious ancient armies did, stripping the dead of anything valuable. From the fingers of the fallen Roman equestrian class, Rome's wealthiest and most politically powerful families, they collected rings by the thousands, later shipped to Carthage and poured across the Senate floor as undeniable proof of the scale of the disaster. It remains one of the strangest and most literal measurements of a battlefield's carnage in the ancient world. Victory counted not in territory or plunder, but in a pile of jewelry stripped from the dead dot in the days after Cannae. Hannibal's cavalry commander Hannibal reportedly urged him to march on Rome itself immediately, while the city stood undefended and paralyzed with grief. Rome, he argued, could be finished within days. Hannibal hesitated, weighing supply lines, siege equipment he did not have, and an unconquered city whose walls he had never tested. He chose not to march. Hannibal's response, recorded by Livy, has echoed through military history for over 2,000 years. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one, Rome. Meanwhile, did something almost nobody expected from a city that had just lost an entire generation of its army in a single afternoon. It refused to negotiate. When Hannibal offered to ransom his Roman prisoners back to their families, the Senate said no, choosing to let its own captured citizens remain in enemy hands, rather than legitimize the idea that Rome could be broken. And when Consul Varro finally returned to Rome, the architect, by most modern accounts, of the very formation that walked into Hannibal's trap, the Senate did not exile him or execute him. Livy records that the Senate publicly thanked him instead for not despairing of the Republic. Compare that to a Spartan trembler stripped of fire and bread for surviving a battle he did not choose to lose. Rome, staring at the worst military disaster in its history, chose forgiveness over shame, and it may be the single decision that saved the Republic. Rome went back to Fabius's patient strategy, avoided open battle with Hannibal for years, slowly strangled his supply lines and his Italian alliances, and eventually won the war entirely on a different continent, at Zama 16 years later. Under a young general who had survived Cannae as little more than a boy, Hannibal built the most perfect tactical trap in the history of ancient warfare. A plan so precise it is still taught in military academies today as a model of the double envelopment. And it still was not enough to win him the war. Somewhere in that gap, between winning an afternoon and winning a decade, is the entire lesson of Cannae. A city that forgave its failures kept fighting long after a battle that should have ended it. A general who mastered the field could not master what came next. So here is the question worth sitting with tonight. If Rome had punished Varro the way Sparta punished its trembler, stripped him of honor, cast him out, made an example of his survival, would the Republic have found the will to keep fighting at all? Tell me what you think in the comments.